The pale winter light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the worn wooden pews of St. Matthew's Church in rural Pennsylvania. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, coating the small town in a pristine blanket of white. The church stood empty on this Tuesday afternoon. No congregation, no choir, no pastor delivering sermons from the pulpit. Just silence interrupted only by the occasional creak of the old building settling against the cold. And Donald Trump, the 47th President of the United States, sat alone in the front pew, his normally commanding presence diminished by the vastness of the empty sanctuary. His shoulders, usually squared with confidence before roaring crowds, now slumped forward. The characteristic brightness in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a distant gaze fixed on the altar before him. His arrival in town had been unannounced, a rare moment of genuine privacy for a man whose life had been lived in the spotlight for decades. Secret Service agents maintained a respectful distance, positioned outside the church doors, having been instructed to give the president his space. "Just 30 minutes, he had told them. "I need 30 minutes alone." The request had come after weeks of nonstop activity, rallies, meetings, press conferences, and the constant barrage of both criticism and adulation that followed his every move. But something had changed in the president's demeanor over the past few days. Those closest to him had noticed a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. It was as though something weighed on his spirit, a burden invisible to others but undeniably present in his quieter moments. As Trump sat in contemplation, his mind wandered to conversations with his late father, to boardrooms where fortunes were made and lost, to the Oval Office where world-changing decisions rested on his shoulders. Success had always been his North Star, but lately he found himself questioning what it all meant. The wealth, the power, the influence. They suddenly seemed hollow in the face of deeper questions he couldn't answer. Outside the church, 9-year-old Sophia Matthews clutched her grandmother's hand as they made their way down the snowy sidewalk. "Can we go inside the church, Grandma?" Sophia asked, her breath visible in the cold air. "I want to pray for Daddy before he leaves again." Sophia's father, a staff sergeant in the Army, was set to deploy overseas in 2 days, his third tour of duty. The prospect of her father's absence had awakened in Sophia a spiritual curiosity beyond her years. Prayer had become her refuge, her way of maintaining connection across oceans and continents. Margaret Matthews looked down at her granddaughter, noting the determination in her young eyes. "Of course, sweetheart. I'm sure Pastor Williams won't mind us popping in for a moment." As they approached the church, they were surprised to see black SUVs parked discreetly on the street. A man in a dark suit and earpiece stood by the entrance, his alert posture suggesting he was more than just a visitor. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said as they approached. "The church is temporarily closed." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Closed? On a Tuesday afternoon? We just need a moment to pray. My granddaughter's father is deploying." The agent's expression softened slightly, but he remained firm. "I understand, ma'am, but I'm afraid I can't." "It's President Trump, isn't it?" Sophia interrupted, her voice carrying the straightforward curiosity only children possess. "I recognize the cars from TV." The agent hesitated, thrown off by the child's directness. "Please," Sophia continued, "I won't bother him. I just want to pray for my daddy." Something in the girl's earnest request seemed to touch the agent. He spoke quietly into his wrist microphone, then waited for a response. After a moment, he nodded. "5 minutes," he said, stepping aside, "and I'll need to accompany you." Inside the church, Donald Trump was startled from his thoughts by the sound of the heavy door opening. Turning, he saw a Secret Service agent enter, followed by an elderly woman and a small girl in a red winter coat. The girl's cheeks were pink from the cold, and she carried a small, well-worn Bible clutched against her chest. Trump straightened his posture, instinctively preparing to assume the presidential persona the public expected. But before the agent could explain the intrusion, the girl broke free from her grandmother's grasp and walked directly down the center aisle toward him. "Sophia!" her grandmother called in a harsh whisper. "Come back here." But Sophia continued forward, her eyes fixed on the president with the unburdened directness that only children possess. As she approached, Trump found himself smiling despite his melancholy mood. There was something refreshingly authentic about a child's approach. No agenda, no pretense, No political calculation. "Hello, Mr. President," Sophia said, stopping a respectful distance from him. "I'm sorry to interrupt your quiet time." Trump nodded, struck by the girl's politeness. "That's all right. Sometimes an interruption is exactly what you need." His voice sounded different to his own ears, softer, without the performative edge he often employed. "My name is Sophia," she continued. "My daddy is a soldier, and he's going away again to protect our country. I came to pray for him." Trump's expression grew serious. "Your daddy is a brave man, Sophia." "What's his name?" "Staff Sergeant Daniel Matthews, sir." "Staff Sergeant Matthews," Trump repeated, committing the name to memory. "You must be very proud of him." Sophia nodded, her eyes suddenly glistening with unshed tears. "I am. But I'm also scared." She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "Can I ask you something, Mr. President?" "Of course you can." The girl tilted her head slightly, studying him with innocent intensity. "What does God mean to you?" The question hung in the air, so unexpected and yet so fundamental that it momentarily robbed Trump of speech. In the vast cathedral of political discourse, spiritual matters were often relegated to carefully scripted sound bites in campaign appearances. But here, in this empty church with no cameras rolling and no advisors whispering in his ear, the question struck at something deeper. Trump glanced toward the stained glass window depicting Jesus with children gathered around him. The colored light played across his features as he considered his response. "Come sit," he said, patting the space beside him on the pew. Sophia hesitated, glancing back at her grandmother, who stood with the Secret Service agent at a respectful distance. At Margaret's encouraging nod, Sophia climbed onto the pew next to the President of the United States. "You know," Trump began, his voice lower and more contemplative than the booming declarations he made from podiums, "I've been asked thousands of questions in my life, about business, about politics, about my family. But that question, what God means to me, that's not one I get asked very often." He paused. "Not like that, anyway. Not so directly." Sophia waited, her eyes never leaving his face. "I grew up going to church," Trump continued. "My parents took us every Sunday. We'd get dressed up. I'd wear these little suits, and my shoes would always be polished so bright you could see your reflection in them." A faint smile crossed his lips at the memory. "But you know what? I don't think I really understood what it all meant back then. It was just something we did." The president's gaze drifted upward toward the vaulted ceiling of the church. "As I got older, I got busy, very busy, building things, making deals. I didn't think about God much during those years, except maybe when I needed something." His candor surprised even himself. "And that's not really how it's supposed to work, is it?" Sophia shook her head solemnly. "Grandma says God isn't a vending machine where you put in prayers and get out candy." Trump let out a genuine laugh, the first in what felt like weeks. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." The girl nodded earnestly. "She is. She says God is always listening, even when we think he isn't." "You know, I think she's right about that," Trump said, his expression growing more serious. "But to really answer your question," he drew a deep breath, searching for words that weren't crafted by speechwriters or filtered through political expediency. "God to me has become," he paused, seeming to choose his words with unusual care, "a reminder that there are things much bigger than myself." His voice grew quieter. "That's not an easy thing for me to admit, Sophia. I've spent my whole life trying to be the biggest thing in the room." As he spoke, something shifted in Trump's demeanor. The carefully constructed facade, polished over decades in the public eye, seemed to crack just slightly, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the mythology. "I lost my brother Fred many years ago," he continued, his voice catching slightly. He was a great guy, the best, but he struggled with alcohol, and it took him from us too soon." Trump rarely spoke of his brother's battle with alcoholism and its tragic end. Yet here, in this quiet church with an attentive child, the words came more easily. "When he died, I asked why. Why him? Why like that? I was angry at the world, at the doctors, maybe even at God." He shook his head slightly. "But over time, I started to understand something. God wasn't punishing Fred or me or anyone. Things happen in this world. hard things, sad things, and sometimes there aren't easy answers. As Trump spoke, tears began to well in his eyes, a sight so unexpected that Sophia instinctively reached out and placed her small hand on his. The gesture, simple and compassionate, broke something loose within him. A single tear escaped, trailing down his cheek. God, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, means that I'm not alone, even when it feels like I am. That there's meaning, even when I can't see it. Another tear followed the first. That there's forgiveness, even when I don't deserve it. The President of the United States, a man known for projecting strength at all costs, sat in a small church in Pennsylvania with tears streaming down his face, no longer trying to hide them. The weight he had been carrying, the questions that had been plaguing him, seemed to pour out with each tear. I don't talk about this stuff much, he admitted, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. Maybe I should. Sophia, witnessing a vulnerability few had ever seen in this powerful man, squeezed his hand tighter. My daddy cries sometimes too, she said. He says it washes the soul. Trump regarded the child with amazement. Your daddy's not only brave, but he's smart too. For several moments they sat in silence. The only sound the gentle whir of the church's heating system and the distant muffled conversations of Secret Service agents outside. The President of the United States and a 9-year-old girl connected in a moment of unexpected grace. I have something for you, Sophia finally said, opening her Bible. She carefully removed a small bookmark, handmade with colorful yarn tassels, and a verse written in childish handwriting. I made this. It's my favorite verse. When I get scared about my daddy, I read it. Trump accepted the bookmark, reading the carefully printed words, Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Joshua 1:9. I think maybe you need it right now more than I do, Sophia said with the simple generosity of a child. Trump closed his fingers around the small gift, a treasure more valuable in that moment than any gold-plated acquisition in his vast portfolio. Thank you, Sophia. I'll keep it with me. And he meant it. As the girl returned to her grandmother, Trump felt something he hadn't expected to find in this empty church. A sense of lightness, as though some burden had been lifted. The tears had cleansed something within him, just as Sophia's father had suggested. And the question, that simple, profound question from an innocent child, had forced him to articulate truths he had long avoided confronting. Later that evening, after Sophia and her grandmother had gone home, after the Secret Service had escorted the president back to his waiting motorcade, a small news item appeared on the local station. President Trump makes surprise visit to St. Matthew's Church. The report mentioned that he had spoken with a local family, but provided no details of the conversation. No cameras had captured the tears. No microphones had recorded the words. But something had changed. Those close to the president noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor in the days that followed. He began carrying a small, colorful bookmark in the breast pocket of his suit, a splash of childish color against the formal attire. When asked about it by curious staffers, he would simply touch the pocket and smile, saying, "A reminder from a very wise young lady." And somewhere in that same town, a 9-year-old girl told her father, as he prepared to leave for his deployment, about her conversation with the president. I think he needed someone to talk to, Daddy, she explained, just like I sometimes do when you're away. Staff Sergeant Matthews hugged his daughter tightly. Sounds like you did a real service for your country, sweetheart, he told her. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask the questions others are afraid to ask. In the weeks and months that followed, commentators would note subtle changes in Trump's public references to faith and service. A new depth, a more personal tone. Few would ever know the source of this evolution. A winter afternoon in an empty church, a child's direct question, and the tears that answered it. For in the end, it wasn't politics or power or wealth that reached the man behind the office, but something far simpler and more profound. The honest curiosity of a child, unafraid to ask what God meant to a president in need of meaning.